Researchers at Harvard's Women's Health Study followed nearly 40,000 women for over a decade and found something most doctors still don't mention at your annual checkup. One specific vitamin, taken consistently, was tied to a 21% drop in the risk of dangerous blood clots forming in the legs. For women who already had a clotting history, that number nearly doubled. And that's just one of 6 vitamins vascular researchers have quietly been studying for years, all connected to the same problem. The heaviness, the swelling, the aching veins that show up in your legs after 60 and that most people just accept as getting old. Here's what almost nobody tells you. Your veins don't just carry blood. They rely on valves to push that blood back up to your heart against gravity all day, every day. When those valves weaken or when the vein walls themselves lose their strength, blood starts pooling in your lower legs. That's the throbbing by evening. That's the swelling around your ankles. That's the visible veins that seem to appear overnight. And according to vascular medicine researchers, a huge part of what keeps those vein walls strong, keeps blood flowing the right direction, and keeps clots from forming, comes down to nutrients most of us are quietly running low on after 60. Today we're covering 6 vitamins backed by real clinical research, not vague wellness claims, each with the specific research behind it, the right dosage, and exactly when and how to take it so your body actually uses it. Stick around because the 6th one is deficient in as many as 1 in 4 people over 80, and it's tied directly to that numb, tingling feeling so many people mistake for just poor circulation. What makes this different from the usual eat more vegetables advice is that vein and circulation health isn't one single process. It's actually several separate systems working together. The physical strength of the vein wall itself, how easily your blood clots or doesn't clot, whether calcium is being deposited where it shouldn't be inside your vessels, how well the microscopic lining of your vessels responds to demand, how effectively your vessels widen to let blood through, and whether the nerves running down your legs are getting what they need to function properly. Each of the 6 vitamins we're covering maps to one of those specific mechanisms, based on actual clinical and observational research. Not a single one of them is a guess. Before we get into it, drop your age in the comments and be honest, how often do your legs feel heavy or swollen by the end of the day? Knowing that helps you see exactly which of these 6 matters most for you. Vitamin C, rebuilding the structure of your vein walls. Let's start with the one your body needs just to hold your veins together structurally. Vitamin C isn't just an immune support vitamin. It's a required building block for collagen, the protein that gives your vein walls their strength and elasticity. Without enough of it, vein walls become weaker and more prone to stretching, and a stretched vein wall is exactly what allows blood to pool and valves to fail. This isn't theoretical. Research summarized by the Life Extension Institute's review of chronic venous disease points to studies showing that people with chronic leg ulcers, one of the more severe outcomes of long-term vein problems, consistently measured lower blood levels of vitamin C than people without ulcers. More recently, a position paper published by the Italian Society of Angiology and Vascular Medicine reviewed clinical trials combining vitamin C with other compounds for chronic venous disease, and one of the featured trials found that limb heaviness improved in roughly 83% of patients and leg pain improved in about 81% after a course of treatment, along with a measurable decrease in ankle swelling after 12 weeks. Right amount? For general vein support, most research protocols use somewhere in the range of 500 to 1,000 milligrams daily, taken as 2 smaller doses rather than 1 large one, because vitamin C is water-soluble and your body can only absorb and use so much at once. Right timing. Split doses, 1 in the morning and 1 in the early evening, ideally with food, which reduces the mild stomach irritation some people notice on an empty stomach. Splitting the dose isn't just a minor detail, it directly affects how much your body can actually absorb and use, since vitamin C absorption efficiency drops as single-dose amounts get larger, meaning 2 smaller doses spread through the day genuinely deliver more usable vitamin C than 1 large dose taken all at once. Best sources. Citrus fruits, red bell peppers, kiwi, and strawberries are some of the most concentrated whole food sources, all of which also bring in flavonoids that researchers believe work alongside vitamin C to further support vein elasticity. One caution worth knowing, very high doses over 2,000 milligrams a day can cause digestive upset in some people, so more isn't automatically better here. Consistency matters far more than a single large dose. It's also worth understanding why this deficiency creeps up specifically after 60. Vitamin C isn't stored in your body the way fat-soluble vitamins are. Your body flushes out what it doesn't use within a day, which means yesterday's intake doesn't carry over to today. Add in that appetite naturally decreases with age, and that fresh produce intake tends to drop off in a lot of people's daily routines, and you get a slow, quiet decline in vein wall supporting vitamin C that nobody notices until symptoms show up. This is part of why researchers studying chronic leg ulcers specifically flagged low vitamin C status as a marker worth watching in older patients, not just a general wellness suggestion. But building strong vein walls is only half the picture. You also need to protect against what happens inside those veins, and that brings us to a vitamin with one of the most surprising findings in the entire list. Vitamin E, cutting clot risk in a large long-term trial. This is the vitamin behind that Harvard statistic from the opening. In the Women's Health Study, close to 40,000 women aged 45 and older were randomly assigned to either 600 IU of natural vitamin E every other day or a placebo, and were followed for over 10 years. Published in the journal Circulation, the results showed a 21% reduction in venous thromboembolism, which includes both deep vein clots and clots that travel to the lungs, among women taking vitamin E. For women who already had a documented clotting history before the study began, the risk reduction climbed to 44%. And in a further breakdown reported by the Linus Pauling Institute at Oregon State University, the protective effect was actually strongest in women aged 65 and older, at a 26% reduction, exactly the age group most at risk for these events in the first place. The proposed mechanism is fascinating. Researchers believe vitamin E works partly by mildly counterbalancing vitamin K's clotting activity in the bloodstream, helping keep blood from becoming overly prone to forming clots in slow-moving venous blood, which is exactly the kind of blood flow you get in legs that sit still for long stretches of the day. Right amount, research-backed doses in these trials used around 400 IU every other day. For general vein and circulation support through food and modest supplementation, many practitioners suggest staying in the 100 to 400 IU daily range unless a doctor has advised otherwise. Right timing. Vitamin E is fat-soluble, meaning it needs to be taken with a meal that contains some fat to actually be absorbed into your bloodstream. Taking it on an empty stomach means much of it simply passes through unused. Best sources. Almonds, sunflower seeds, and spinach are excellent whole food sources that pair naturally with a fat-containing meal. Important caution, because of its mild blood-thinning property, anyone already taking prescription blood thinners like warfarin should talk to their doctor before adding vitamin E supplements, since the combined effect on bleeding risk needs medical oversight, not guesswork. It's worth being clear about what this research does and doesn't say. Broader reviews on vitamin E in general cardiovascular disease risk, including analyses published in JAMA and The Lancet, haven't found the same broad protective effect for heart attacks or overall cardiovascular events. The clot prevention finding from the Women's Health Study is specific to venous thromboembolism, not a claim that vitamin E prevents heart disease broadly. That distinction matters because it's a good example of why this entire list focuses on vein and circulation-specific research rather than borrowing general heart health claims that don't actually apply to the same mechanism. Now, vitamin E helps keep blood moving smoothly through your veins. But there's a separate problem happening inside the vessel wall itself as we age, one that most people have never even heard of, and it's where our next vitamin comes in. Vitamin K2, stopping calcium from stiffening your vessels. Here's something most people don't know. Calcium doesn't just belong in your bones. As we age, calcium can begin depositing inside the walls of your blood vessels themselves, a process called vascular calcification, and it makes vessels stiffer and less able to flex and respond to blood flow the way healthy, youthful vessels do. The protein responsible for keeping calcium out of your vessel walls and directing it toward your bones instead is called matrix GLA protein, and according to research published in the journal Circulation from a randomized clinical trial on vitamin K2 and vitamin D, that protein cannot function properly without adequate vitamin K2. Vitamin K deficiency has been directly linked in multiple studies to increased calcium buildup in vessel walls. In one clinical trial highlighted by the Life Extension Institute, a long-acting form of vitamin K2 produced a measurable reduction in arterial stiffness in human participants, something researchers had only observed in animal studies until that point. Separate case control research published in 2025 comparing people with coronary artery disease to healthy controls found that lower blood levels of vitamin K2 analogs were consistently associated with vascular calcification and disease progression, reinforcing that this isn't a fringe theory, it's an active, ongoing area of cardiovascular research. Right amount. Most clinical research on menaquinone 7, the long-acting form of vitamin K2, uses doses in the range of 90 to 200 micrograms daily for general vascular support, with higher clinical doses reserved for supervised medical trials. Right timing. Like vitamin E, K2 is fat-soluble, so take it with a meal containing some fat for proper absorption. Many people find it easiest to pair with dinner. Best sources. Natto, a fermented soybean dish common in Japan, is by far the richest source, along with aged cheeses like Gouda and egg yolks in smaller amounts. Critical caution. If you are on blood-thinning medication such as warfarin, vitamin K2 can interfere significantly with how that medication works, and this is not a vitamin to self-supplement without your doctor's direct guidance if you're on a blood thinner. There's also an important distinction between vitamin K1 and K2 worth knowing. K1, found in leafy greens like kale and spinach, is what most people associate with vitamin K, and it's primarily used by your liver for blood clotting. K2 behaves differently in the body. It travels to peripheral tissues, including your blood vessel walls, which is exactly why researchers studying vascular calcification specifically focus on K2 rather than K1. Getting plenty of leafy greens is genuinely good for you, but if vascular support is the specific goal, research points to K2 as the form that actually reaches the vessel wall tissue in question. If you've made it this far, you're already ahead of most people who never learn any of this. Quick question before we move to number 4. Which of the first 3 are you already getting through food, vitamin C, E, or K2? Type it below, it helps you see where your actual gaps are. Vitamin D, the lining inside your vessels depends on it. Every single blood vessel in your body is lined with a paper-thin layer of cells called the endothelium, and that lining is what actually controls how well your vessels dilate to allow healthy blood flow. Research published in the American Heart Association journal Hypertension measured this directly using a technique called flow-mediated dilation, essentially testing how well the brachial artery widens in response to increased blood flow. The study found that adults with vitamin D deficiency had significantly weaker dilation response, meaning their vessels physically responded worse to demands for increased blood flow, compared to adults with sufficient vitamin D levels, even though all participants were otherwise free of diagnosed disease. And this matters enormously for people over 60, because deficiency at this age is far more common than most people realize. National Health Survey data analyzed across a multi-year period found that nearly 20% of middle-aged and older American adults were vitamin D deficient by standard lab cutoffs, and when you widen the definition to include insufficient levels rather than only deficient, some analyses put that number above 1 in 3 older adults. A separate long-running observational study following adults for an average of over 5 years found that people with the lowest vitamin D levels had a meaningfully elevated risk of developing a first cardiovascular event compared to those with adequate levels. Right amount. For adults over 60 with low or borderline vitamin D levels, many clinical protocols use 1,000 to 2,000 IU daily for maintenance, though a blood test is genuinely the only accurate way to know your personal starting point, since needs vary enormously based on skin tone, geography, and existing levels. Right timing. Take vitamin D with your largest meal of the day, ideally one containing fat, since this measurably improves absorption compared to taking it on an empty stomach or with a fat-free meal. Best sources. Fatty fish like salmon and mackerel, fortified dairy or plant milk, egg yolks, and safe, moderate sun exposure on bare skin, which your body still uses to help produce its own vitamin D even later in life, though production does slow with age, since skin becomes measurably less efficient at converting sunlight into usable vitamin D as we get older, which is part of why supplementation tends to matter more in this age group than it did decades earlier. One honest note, because deficiency is so common and so easy to miss without testing, this is genuinely one of the more worthwhile vitamins to get an actual blood test for, rather than guessing at a dose. Geography and lifestyle both play a bigger role here than most people assume. Research tracking older adults in the UK found deficiency rates as high as 26% using stricter lab cutoffs, and closer to 59% using broader, insufficient cutoffs, in populations living at higher latitudes where sun exposure is limited for large parts of the year. If you live somewhere with long winters, spend most of your day indoors, or simply wear sunscreen consistently, which is smart for skin health but does reduce vitamin D synthesis, your personal risk of deficiency is almost certainly higher than the national averages already cited. Your vessel lining needs vitamin D to function properly. But actually getting blood to move through that vessel efficiently, especially all the way down to your lower legs, depends on something else entirely, a process called vasodilation, and that's where our next vitamin has one of the most studied effects on the entire list. Niacin, vitamin B3, widening the vessels that feed your legs. If you've ever taken a niacin supplement and felt a sudden warm, flushed feeling across your skin, that's not a side effect to be alarmed by. That's actually the vitamin doing exactly what researchers have studied it for. Widening your blood vessels, a process called vasodilation. According to a detailed research review from the independent nutrition research organization Examine, niacin has been specifically studied for its ability to improve blood flow in patients with low HDL cholesterol, and separate research has explored its historical use for peripheral artery disease and intermittent claudication, both conditions involving poor blood flow to the legs. The mechanism goes deeper than just the visible flush. Research published in the American Heart Association's Journal on Arteriosclerosis and Vascular Biology identified that niacin activates a specific receptor, called TRPV1, that triggers blood vessels near the skin surface to widen. Beyond that surface effect, niacin has also been connected in research to nitric oxide pathway support, nitric oxide being the same molecule your body naturally produces to signal blood vessels to relax and open, and to supporting healthy endothelial function, the same vessel lining we just discussed with vitamin D. Right amount. This is a vitamin where more caution is genuinely warranted compared to the others on this list. Standard dietary intake through food, typically in the 14 to 16 mg range for older adults, is safe and beneficial for general nerve and metabolic health. Higher therapeutic doses used in clinical vascular research, sometimes 500 mg or more, are typically extended-release formulations used under direct medical supervision because of effects on liver enzymes and blood sugar that need monitoring. Right timing. If using a supplement form, taking it with food in the evening can reduce the intensity of the flushing sensation for people who find it uncomfortable. Best sources: turkey, chicken, peanuts, mushrooms, and whole grains are all solid dietary sources that provide niacin without any flushing effect at all, since food-based niacin doesn't trigger the same receptor response as concentrated supplement doses. Important caution: high-dose niacin supplementation should only be started under a doctor's supervision, particularly for anyone with liver concerns, diabetes, or anyone already taking cholesterol medication, since the combination needs monitoring. There's a form worth knowing about if flushing is a deal-breaker for you. Niacinamide, a closely related form of vitamin B3, does not trigger the same vasodilation or flushing response, because it doesn't activate the same skin receptor pathway. It still supports general cellular energy metabolism, but research specifically on peripheral blood flow improvement centers on niacin itself, not niacinamide, so if circulation support is your specific goal, that distinction matters when you're reading supplement labels. We've covered vein wall strength, clot prevention, vessel stiffness, vessel lining health, and vessel widening. That leaves one more piece of this puzzle, and it might be the most overlooked of all, because the deficiency itself is shockingly common in exactly the age group watching this video right now. Vitamin B12, the deficiency behind that circulation feeling in your legs. Here's a statistic that genuinely surprises most people. According to the Foundation for Peripheral Neuropathy, it's estimated that between 10 and 25% of people over the age of 80 have a vitamin B12 deficiency. And this matters enormously for how we're talking about circulation, because a huge amount of what people describe as poor circulation in their legs, the tingling, the numbness, the odd pins and needles sensation, isn't actually a blood flow problem at all. It's a nerve problem caused by low B12, and it gets mistaken for circulation trouble constantly. B12 is essential for maintaining the protective myelin sheath around your nerves. Research published in the journal Current Nutrition Reports found that measurable nerve involvement, detectable on physical examination, shows up in roughly 1 in 4 patients with confirmed B12 deficiency, with early symptoms typically including that exact tingling and numbness sensation in the hands and feet that so many people over 60 write off as just circulation, without ever getting it checked. There's an additional wrinkle specific to people over 60. Absorption of B12 from food naturally declines with age, because it requires adequate stomach acid and a specific protein called intrinsic factor to be absorbed properly, and both of those decline over time. On top of that, common medications in this age group, including acid reducers and the diabetes medication metformin, are independently linked in research to further lowering B12 levels, which is part of why deficiency rates specifically climb in older populations compared to younger adults. Right amount. For general maintenance, many clinicians recommend 500 to 1,000 micrograms daily in supplement form for adults over 60, specifically because oral absorption efficiency is lower at this age, so a higher intake compensates for what your body can actually absorb. Right timing. Take it in the morning on an empty stomach if tolerated, since B12 doesn't require dietary fat for absorption the way vitamins D, E, and K2 do, and taking it earlier in the day works well for most people's routines. Best sources: eggs, fish, poultry, and fortified cereals. For anyone on metformin or long-term acid-reducing medication, a simple blood test to check B12 status is genuinely worth asking your doctor about at your next visit, since this deficiency is both common and easy to correct once identified. One more thing worth flagging. Research published in the European Journal of Neurology on B vitamin status and nerve health found that the general population rate of peripheral neuropathy sits around 9.4%, but that number climbs substantially higher in older adults and in anyone with an underlying B12 deficiency, regardless of whether they also have diabetes. That's an important point because a lot of people assume tingling or numbness in the feet automatically means diabetic nerve damage, when for a meaningful share of older adults, a simple, correctable B12 deficiency is actually the driver, and it responds to supplementation far faster than diabetic neuropathy typically does. So that's all 6. Vitamin C for structural vein strength, vitamin E for reducing clot risk, vitamin K2 for keeping calcium out of your vessel walls, vitamin D for the vessel lining that controls blood flow, niacin for actually widening those vessels, and B12 for the nerve health that's so often confused with poor circulation entirely. None of these are exotic. All 6 show up in a normal grocery store, and most of what's covered here comes down to consistency and correct timing rather than expensive supplements. If this helped you understand what's actually happening in your legs, subscribe because next we're covering the 3 daily habits that are quietly damaging your vein valves without you ever noticing, and the first one is something almost everyone over 60 does every single evening without realizing it. One last thing before you go. None of what we covered today is meant to replace an actual conversation with your doctor, especially since a few of these vitamins interact directly with common medications like blood thinners and diabetes drugs. What this research does give you is something a lot more useful than a vague, eat healthier, suggestion. 6 specific, testable, correctable factors that vascular researchers have actually studied in connection with vein and circulation health, with real dosage ranges and real timing guidance behind each one. If your legs have been feeling heavier than they used to, that's worth bringing up at your next appointment, and now you'll actually know what to ask about.